Good evening, everyone. And as last week and the next couple of weeks, we're going to start with prayer, the same one we had last week, so please stand. Holy wisdom, lamp of learning, bless the light that reason lends. Teach us judgment as we kindle sparks of thought your Spirit sends. Sanctify our search for knowledge and the truth that sets us free. Come illumine mind and spirit, joined in deepest unity. Vine of truth, in you we flourish, by your grace we learn and grow. May the word of Christ among us shape our life, our search to know. Joined to Christ in living, dying, may we help the church convey witness to the saving gospel, bearing fruit of faith today. The title of tonight's session is Why Recognizing Different Kinds of Truth Matters. I can answer that very quickly. If we don't recognize the kind of truth we're dealing with, we're going to misunderstand, misinterpret, we're going to get it wrong, we're going to violate it. But that's the short answer. I've got a lot more to kick into that. And I realized that perhaps last week didn't have enough content. So I thought I would make sure that there was enough content tonight. Okay. So the overview. As I was thinking about this, there were two experiential points of entry that guided me. One was when I was a senior at Borromeo College. I was taking a course, a required course called Metaphysics. And the professor was a man named Dr. Tony Yetzi. You may recognize that name. But anyway, the very first day he came into class, one of the very first things he said was, "There is a real world and you may know it." And I thought, that's a very strange thing to say. There is a real world and you may know it. It was only many years later, after I had been at Catholic University and was teaching, that I tumbled to the fact that I think he was reacting to a philosophy that was prominent in Europe at the time called postmodernism. And postmodernism basically said that when you read something, the only meaning is the interaction among the words. It doesn't have any reference to the real world. And so he was saying, there is a real world, and you may know it. The second experiential point of entry for me tonight is something that my mother said. And we had this in her casket when she died. Marianne, what was it?
It is what it is.
It is what it is, right? And my mother isn't the only person who uses that line, but again, it seems self-evident. It is what it is until you ask, well, what is it? Or what is it not? But those two things kind of were my stimulus for what I hope we can do tonight. So, the first thing, part one, I brainstormed a list of kinds of truths. These are out of my mind, out of my reading. Arguably, people could come up with different lists and different ways of describing them, but I thought I might put forth for you lists of different kinds of truth, and for the record, there are 22 different kinds that I came up with. And then, when we go to the small group conversation, I'm going to ask you your impressions of those lists and what makes sense to you, how you would verify those. And then in the second part, I'm going to try to draw some general conclusions considering those examples of kinds of truth about what is involved in seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth. Then, some more small group conversations and closing prayer. And in theory, we'll be done by 8:30. I promise you we won't go beyond that. I'll cut short if we have to. So let's look at lists, kinds of truth. And again, these are my characterizations. They might not all be completely accurate. They don't all mutually cohere, which is one criteria for truth, coherence. But bear with me. So the first kind of truth I want to mention is mathematical. I mentioned a book last week called The Death of Truth and cited it. There was an example in that book that the author said he was aware of a conversation that a student was having with a teacher. And the question was, how much is 6 times 7? And the student said, 41. And the teacher said, I disagree. And the point of the story was, you don't have to, that's not the right answer. The right answer is 6 times 7 is 42. You gave the wrong answer. So it's not just a question of disagreeing. Logical truth has that kind of confidence and certainty. Then there's what I'm calling logical truth. And I think the easiest way to think about logical truth is that it is often deductive. So here's an example. A, all Ohioans live in the United States. B, Bill is an Ohioan. So C, Bill lives in the United States, right? So that's an example of logical or deductive truth. Now this gets a little fuzzier. Objective or subjective truth. I'm saying that something is objectively true regardless of what the person thinks about it. So here's an example. I might think that I can fly, but if I step out of a 10th floor window, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to fall and die. Okay? That's the objective truth, that I can't fly. There's a law of gravity that kicks in. Okay? Subjective truth is something is true depending upon one's perspective. So if I go down to the lake and I look at the skyline, I might say, that's a beautiful sunset. That's a matter of perspective. Someone else might have a different perspective on that. So objective, subjective truth. This next one is a little bit like it. Absolute and relative truth. I'm calling absolute truth something that is true in every situation all the time. My example is, Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system. That's just going to be true all the time. That's an absolute truth when stated that way. Relative truth is dependent upon its context and relations to other truths. So I might say Jupiter is not the largest object in our solar system. Or if I said Jupiter is the largest object in the solar system, that would be a relative truth because the sun is bigger. But from an absolute perspective, Jupiter is the largest planet in the solar system. So you can see these are kind of fuzzy categories. And then there's what I'm calling scientific truth. My sense of this is that science seeks objectivity. And scientific truth involves observation and, where possible, experimentation. Okay? It is evidence-based. It often begins with a hypothesis that is tested, and the results of the tests have to be verified. It's the nature of a hypothesis that it's open to refinement and disproof depending upon the discovery of additional and or contradictory information. And from what I know about science, the results of investigation and experimentation are often published and subject to peer review and correction. And sometimes people make a distinction between hard and soft science. So hard sciences would be things like chemistry, physics, biology, where soft sciences would be more akin to the human sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, economics. Again, these are my descriptions of kinds of truth. Then there's what I'm calling laws of nature. Conditions or aspects of the world that are true always and everywhere, immutable and which we must accept. So here's some examples. Animals need nourishment to survive. I think that's a law of nature. All living animals eventually die. I think that's a law of nature. Nothing travels faster than the speed of light. I think that's the law of nature. Then there's what some call symbolic truth. We experience the real, but very often what we experience as real is mediated through symbols. Okay, so symbols put us in touch with the real, and they allow us to communicate about the real. And symbolic truth involves systems of symbols. And those systems of symbols help to interpret one another and become a resource for making assertions about what's real. Symbols are multivalent. They can have multiple true meanings depending upon the context and other variables. Then we have what I'm calling narrative truth. Narrative truth is truth that is disclosed, encountered in, and communicated in stories. This is important. The stories may or may not be of actual or historical events, but they have enough resonance with the people who are hearing them as to communicate a truth to someone even though they were not part of such a story. So somehow stories communicate to us something that resonates inside of us. I mentioned a few books last week. I'm going to mention a few more this week. There's a man named Jonathan Gottschall who wrote this book back in 2012 called The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human. And he says this: the essence of story is not changing. The technology of storytelling has evolved from oral tales to clay tablets to hand-lettered manuscripts to printed books to movies, televisions, Kindles, and iPhones. Fiction is as it was and never will be. And here's what he described it: character plus predicament plus attempted extrication. He says that is the kind of fundamental plot of story. Character plus predicament plus attempted way to get out of the predicament. And the same story can be told from different points of view, yielding different and sometimes contradictory truths. So here's another book I'm going to share with you. It's by a man named James C. Scott. This one's a little bit older. 1990. It's called Domination and the Arts of Resistance: Hidden Transcripts. And his presentation here says that when you have a situation in society where some people are dominant and others are subservient, there is a narrative that describes the situation according to the point of view of the people who are dominant. And that's the one that's public, it's the one that gets print. But then, from the point of view of the people who are subservient, they have another way of telling the story. And they rarely tell that story to the people who are the dominant, unless it's something extraordinary when they summon their truth and they say, oh yeah, well this is how we see it. Okay? But the function of the hidden transcript is to bind the people who are in the subversive setting and to give them a sense of hope. It allows them to talk about their situation in such a way that the dominant people really don't understand fully. But both the dominant and the subservient, are telling a narrative about the same situation, but from different points of view. So narrative works that way as well. then we're coming to what I'm describing with some help from Gottschall as mythic truth. And Gottschall says the purpose of myth is not to provide an objective account of what happened. It's to tell a story that binds a community together. I like this. To take pluribus and make it unum. Okay? And so some examples of this are relatively easy. There's the first two stories in the book of Genesis, two different creation accounts. Those are myths. Okay? They're myths. But they communicate a truth, and the truth that they communicate is something that binds the faith community together. Okay? It tells about other myths, the stories of the first Thanksgiving. There's dozens of stories of the first Thanksgiving. They are myths, and their function is to bind American citizens together. And another myth that he cites is George Washington never told a lie. That's a myth, but it becomes part of what defines our sense of ourselves as a culture, something that's part of our lore, our self-understanding. Excuse me. And now we come to what I'm calling historical truth. As you can see, these things are kind of related to one another. They're not exactly the same, but they're related. As a young person, I remember this when I was studying Scripture. My naive understanding was history tells us what really happened. Maybe, maybe not, okay? It seeks to uncover the events and realities that it chronicles, but often the data is incomplete and biased based upon whose interest is at stake. And as you can see, historical truth is inextricably linked to narrative truth. What gets included and what is left out, what is seen as necessary and as trivial, what is considered historically factual or not, is very much determined not only by the historical sources and their biases, but also upon the interests and biases of the historian. Is that right, Cal?
Oh, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So the obvious case in our country would be who and what is included in U.S. history. From the point of view of the North or the South, black or white, man or woman, there are histories written from all those perspectives, and they aren't all the same. Okay? They're related, but they aren't all the same. So something happened, but what? And what makes for historical truth? And similar things can be said about church history. When I was at Catholic University working on what's called my license degree, I read a book, this goes back to the mid-'80s, by a feminist theologian named Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. Her husband Frank was teaching at Catholic U at the time. And the book was called In Memory of Her, a feminist theological reconstruction of Christian origins. And her thesis in this book is that the culture in which Christianity grew up was patriarchal, and Christianity offered an alternative to that, but very quickly patriarchy and the momentum of patriarchy overshadowed what the original Christians thought, and that's what she talks about in this book. Again, there are other ways of writing this history, but this is an example of how the shape of the history often depends upon the sources and the biases of the people investigating and writing the history. And then there's what I'm calling artistic truths. Some truths are disclosed and encountered not so much by analytic or discursive intellect, but by imagination, often interlaced with language, but not necessarily literal language. So there's truth in painting, in music, in drama, in dance, photography, poetry. One example that I would have of this is, I used this in a homily here years ago. I found a photograph of what looked like two hands holding a luminescent sphere, okay, one on top of the other. And when I saw that, I was attracted to it, I bought it, and I thought, this could be depicting God holding the world in God's hands. Okay? It's communicating a truth. Bill Cervenik, remember Bill? He said to me after I showed that picture, he said you saw God holding the world, I see somebody holding a bowling ball. And I couldn't argue with that. Okay? There was a way in which both of those things could be true. Okay? What is disclosed and encountered is often illuminative of the world and the observers who are observing, throwing new and different light on what might otherwise be ordinary and mundane. Occasionally, when I'm driving, I listen to American Public Radio and plays classical music, and it's very interesting to hear how commentators describe the music and what I would call the truth in the music. Okay? They definitely see truth in the music. So the question that surfaces is, what is the nature of the real that is enclosed and encountered in art? Then there's what I'm calling ethical truth. Truth that discloses and articulates what is right and what is wrong. And often the foundations to which those articulating ethical truth appeal are themselves a matter of dispute. These foundations are often intuitive and difficult to articulate. However, in my judgment, the pursuit of ethical truth, discovering it and abiding by it, is essential to human community and thriving. Then there's metaphysical truth. Who knows what metaphysical truth is? But I'm going to describe it this way. They're the most fundamental truths of all existence, animate and inanimate. Being itself. Categories of understanding and truth that embrace all that is. And I will add that the very existence of this kind of truth is contested. That's what the postmoderns would contest. They would say there is no metaphysical truth. Historically, Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, and such obviously hold to metaphysical truth, but postmodernists do not. A little story here. When I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I was comparing two theologians. One was St. Thomas Aquinas with respect to sacramental theology, and a French theologian named Louis-Marie Chauvet. Chauvet was a postmodernist. And when it came time for my, I don't want to call it defense, my dissertation director asked the question that was potentially explosive, because other people sitting around that room I knew thought differently about it. But he asked me the question, is metaphysics necessary for sacramental theology? And I said, yes. He accepted it, but I saw one of his antagonists around the table nodding his head. Again, some of us take metaphysics for granted, and there's different kinds of metaphysics, okay? But it is what it is, okay? And then there's what I'm calling religious truth. Next week's session is going to be devoted to talking about this kind of truth. But I will be drawing on a man named Robert Cummings Neville, who, if you've been here before, I've mentioned him. I've done a lot of reading with him. I have one of his books here tonight called Recovery of the Measure, Interpretation and Nature, which I'm going to be referring to later. But he defines religious truth as an encounter with the ultimate, with the ultimates in our lives. And he defines, and I'm not going to do it tonight, but he defines and names 5 different ultimates in our life. And as we confront and encounter the ultimate in a variety of ways, that is what he calls religious truth. Some people name the ultimate God, okay? Others don't. But he wants to say whether you name the ultimate God or not, encounters with the ultimate are religious truth. And then ritual truth. Last week I shared something from Roy Rappaport called the it'll come to me, give me a second. Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity. And he describes ritual in that book. He says ritual is a series of behaviors, activities that are basically invariant, and they are established by someone other than the ritual practitioners themselves. And he gives that kind of ritual truth, he calls that canonical truth. But he says there's also non-canonical truth. And that is when a particular celebrating community makes variations in the canonical. And those variations disclose something about the community that is making the variations. So, go to any Catholic church within a 1-mile radius of here. And we celebrate Eucharist on Sundays. Go to any Catholic church in that 1-mile radius, and you're going to see that although it's basically the same, there are variations depending on the community, the resources, the people, presiders, etc. And his contention would be that the variations tell us something about the community itself. We're getting there. Legal judicial truth. I don't know if there is such a thing. Would you say there's legal judicial truth? And I'm just saying it's codified norms for human behavior for individuals and as a community. And it's the measure by which we articulate, regulate, and sustain true and just relations in society. That's my definition. I'm sure a lawyer may say something different.
It works.
Okay. And then autobiographical and introspective truth. Those are the accounts that we give of who we are and how we are. How we've come to be who we are, and what we understand to be the meaning of our lives. And this kind of truth is subject to the vagaries of our memory. Okay. So if I were to ask you to do an autobiographical rendition of your life today, and then ask you to do it again 10 years from now, that story is going to look a little different. And I read a short story that had this as the premise, that it was set in the future, and there was technology that you could wear some device that would record factually everything you experience. And then in the course of this story, as this person wore this device for many, many years, he was asked to talk about his experience. And he talked about his experience, and the device said, "No, you're wrong. You're remembering it wrong." Okay? So autobiographical and introspective experience is subject to the vagaries of how we remember. Interpersonal and relational truth. I'm calling this honesty and authenticity in human interaction. I experience interpersonal and relational truth when I work with couples preparing for marriage, as they talk about their relationship and agree or don't agree, and struggle to name accurately what is the quality of their relationship. And indeed, I might be able to do the same thing with relationships that I have with others. But interpersonal and relational truth gives us some insight not only into the relationship, but who we are. Then there's what I'm calling emotional truth. Accurate and honest acknowledgement of one's emotions in situations and relationships. I suppose we could go appeal to the soft scientific discipline of psychology to help get a clear read on some of that stuff. We can fool ourselves as to what we think we're feeling. We might struggle to name them, but that's what I'm calling emotional truth. That's something near and dear to me. Oratorical and rhetorical truth. I'm calling these linguistic, poetic, or rhetorical flourishes to heighten, emphasize, expand upon the literal meaning of what is being communicated. And it must at least be consistent with or compatible with the literal meaning of what is being expressed. So you may have noticed that homiletically, I often talk in terms of threes. I have 3 examples of this. Okay, I don't always say I have 3 things, and I like alliteration. Okay, those are examples of what I'm calling attempts at communicating and identifying truth oratorically or rhetorically. Then what I'm calling journalistic truth. Quote, objective reporting of the facts of a situation or occurrence. What really happened? Reinforced by evidence of witnesses and video, etc. And of course, this is subject to the strengths and limitations of narrative and history. What facts are reported, how they are related to one another, whose interests they serve, and what are the aims of the reporting. And not least, advertising. The product as advertised. Sometimes has spin, sometimes features, and sometimes the way it describes those features help clarify, and sometimes they obscure the reality of the product being advertised. Also subject to the strengths and limitations of narrative. Okay, so that's my list of kinds of truth. I'm sure there are more, and I'm sure these could be described in different ways, but I put them out there as examples to help you think about these next questions. How would we verify these truth claims? Of course, the word verify refers to, but how would we assess the truth of any of these different kinds of truth? How would we know they're true? How would we know that it is what it is? Or maybe it's not what it is. Which kinds of truth claims are easiest or hardest to verify? And what, if anything, do these kinds of truth have in common? Okay? So, have at it at your table. There's obviously going to be, these are not easy questions, and there could be different ways of approaching them, but just start unpacking them and see what you come up with. Okay, so that was part 1. And remember, I said the method here was to put out different kinds of truth to help us move in a direction of maybe kind of a general theory of truth. And I said it was important to recognize the different kinds of truth, because if we don't account for the different kinds of truth, we're going to misinterpret, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to violate meanings, etc. So I think to just get an experience of the different kinds of truth is a good way to set the groundwork for the next part of the conversation, which I will tell you is going to be challenging. The first part was easy. Okay. So seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in the truth. General observations. I'm going to be relying on this book by Robert Cummings Neville, Recovery of the Measure, Interpretation and Nature. It's 1 volume in a 3-volume series. It goes back to 1989, I think. But I've read many, many things by him after this, and he has developed over and over again the ideas in this book in a lot of different ways, but basically consistent with this. So Neville says human beings are essentially interpreting animals. That human existence is fundamentally an ongoing interpretation of the real, and attempts to verify the interpretations. Now, for the sake of completion here, Neville talks about value rather than the real, but he wants to equate value with the real. It's a very technical term, so I'm just, in order to not trip over that, I'm going to use the word real rather than value. So human beings, human existence is fundamentally ongoing interpretation of the real and attempts to verify the interpretation. He says, we test for truth pragmatically. We test for truth by seeing whether experience positively or negatively reinforces our estimations of the reality of things. We should ask less whether reality conforms to our expectations than whether our interpretations are faithful to reality. And basically, Neville characterizes truth as the carryover of the real, which is outside of us, into us as interpreters. It's the carryover of the real into who we are and how we are. And he says there are 4 things that condition the carryover of the real into who we are in our interpretations. And those are, and I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit, biology, culture, semiotic systems, and purposive interests, with the most ink spent on biology. So I'm going to draw on this book by a neuroscientist, Lisa Feldman Barrett, and the book is called How Emotions Are Made. This book was published 2017. And again, for the sake of just being honest about it, that's a lot of years for neuroscience. And I want to say, additional research might show up some different things than she claims here. But she said the brain receives input from both within the body and outside of it. Within is something she calls, receiving input from within, she calls interoception. And I'm going to just quote her directly here. Interoception is your brain's representation of all the sensation from your internal organs and tissues, the hormones in your blood, and your immune system. And she talks about intrinsic brain activity. She describes it this way: 86 million neurons connected into massive networks, constantly firing, stimulating each other, sometimes millions at a time, continuous from birth until death, kind of like breathing, requiring no external catalyst. Okay. So this interoception, she says, keeps the heart pumping, the lungs breathing, and other internal functions working smoothly. It's also, in her opinion, I think this might be challenged now, it's also the origin of dreams, daydreams, imagination, and mind wandering. And she says it's ultimately the origin of every sensation you experience. Then she talks about things that come from outside of us, from without the body, outside. Visual, auditory, gustatory, somatory, olfactory. We are bombarded by millions of these inputs at the same time as well. Millions on the inside, millions on the outside. And she says the brain does not see colors and shapes that are out there, hear words and music that are out there, taste sweet and sour that are out there, but sorts and organizing the input to create these sensations. Okay? Then she goes on. The brain, trapped within the skull, predicts what these inputs are by comparing them to previous experience. The brain is a predicting organ. And she says it does so prior to our conscious experience. We're not even aware of the fact that our brain is predicting what it is we're experiencing. And when the input matches the previous experience, then it is accepted as such. When it does not match the previous experience, the brain must deal with prediction error. It behaves like a scientist. It could be a responsible scientist and change its predication to respond to the data. It could be a biased scientist, selectively choosing data that fits the hypothesis and ignoring everything else. It could be an unscrupulous scientist, ignoring the data altogether and maintaining that its predictions are reality. Or it can be a curious scientist and just probe a little further. So then all of that brings her to some conclusions here. Our experience of the world, including our religious experience, is not a simple given, but rather something of our own construction. Let me read that again. Our experience of the world, including our religious experience, is not a simple given, but rather something of our own construction. So when we say it is what it is, and when we say what it is, that's something of our own construction. It's not unrelated to what it is, but our description of it, our way of understanding it is of our own construction. This experience is thoroughly embodied. Okay? Thoroughly embodied. Now, why is this important? Because there have been some philosophers in history who have had a very big distinction between mind and body. This is a very embodied understanding. This experience is inextricably linked to previous experience, personal and collective history, and it's socially and culturally embedded. I forgot I had those. Okay, so what Neville is saying is that how we interpret, as interpreting animals, how we encounter the real is qualified by the biology that we have, by the way we operate as living human beings. That makes a difference as to what we perceive, how we perceive it, and the kind of judgments that we come to about it. He says another thing that qualifies our interpretations, our experience of the real, is culture. Now, Neville says this, and I think this also might be challenged today. He says cultural qualification is qualitatively different from biological qualification because it employs imagination. Culture always employs imagery. Biology, never. I'm not sure about that biology never part. I've read some things recently that might run counter to that. But again, with Neville, the function of imagery is to select and organize data into the forms of experience. That it is selective means that it values the data, taking some to be important and the rest to be trivial. Prior to conscious or even unconscious desire and deliberation, one's culture determines much of what will be taken up into experience, in what connections, and with what costs. Culture gives us ways of valuing the world. So in our construction of our experience, which is qualified by our biology, culture also plays a role in how we construct our experience, okay? And how we construct our experience of the real. And then there's also the qualification of what I've already alluded to as systems of signs. And I want to say that these are the context of our conscious interpretation. And Neville says, he describes two different kinds of, well, many more than two, but two. One is extensional. Extensional systems are systems of signs that mutually interpret one another. They don't necessarily find application to our reality, but they're systems of signs. So for example, if I take the word dog and I put it in the middle of a chart, and then around it I put canine, puppy, mutt, purebred, barker, etc. All of those things mutually interpret one another, and those are extensional interpretations. But when someone in the culture that has those meanings of dog actually encounters a dog, they make an intentional sign. They take one of those signs and they intend it to mean this particular animal. So semiotic systems are both extensional and intentional. They're very complex. As I mentioned earlier, the same sign can mean many different things depending on the context. And it allows for a vast array of misinterpretation as well. And then there's what he calls purposive interest. How we encounter, how we carry over the value of the real into ourselves as interpreters depends on the purposes we bring to the interpretation. He calls this purposive interest. And he says, without purposive behavior, biological action would be merely reaction. Cultural imagination would be mere definition of roles, and symbolic representations would be the mere play of signs. Purposive behavior is required to make the other dimensions of participation in the real human in the ways we ordinarily think of them. So, for Neville, truth is, well, you're going to have to hang on to this one. His theory of truth says that truth is the carryover of the real from the object interpreted into the interpretive experience, as qualified by one, the biological nature of the interpreters. He's just going to reiterate what I just said. By the respects in which the interpretation is made, which has to do with how culture weights the importance of the data, is qualified by the form of representations or the signs that are involved, and by the purposes and intentional values guiding the interpretation. So this is Neville's theory of truth. I find it to be quite persuasive, but I've been wrestling with this theory of truth for about 15 or 20 years. So you've just had 5 minutes to think about it, okay? So I'm going to leave this up there, and actually I'm not. And I'll come back to it. I'm going to go to small group conversations. In what way, if any, was this consideration of a general theory of truth helpful in understanding what is involved in seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth? Remember, that's what we're ultimately trying to figure out. What is involved in seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth? I think Neville might have something to say about that and the things that we've talked about. And then you might have additional questions or concerns that surfaced. So I'm going to ask you to start by talking about the first question, and after you've done that, then if you want to surface additional questions or concerns, go ahead. I know that that was a lot. Okay, so there's Neville's adaptive theory of truth. So let me come back. Remember, I also mentioned Dr. Yancey, who said, there is a real, and you may know it. A real world, and you may know it. Neville is saying something about how it is that we know it. Okay? So it's about seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth. Okay, have at it. Okay, so I have one more question that I'd like to ask you. And I'd like to ask if some might be willing to share this with the group. What is your takeaway from tonight? Kathy?
Well, we were talking about how we all come at the subject from different perspectives. So I think the challenge is we all have truths, but we're all kind of dancing around the real truth. We all have a version of the truth, and zeroing in on the actual truth is challenging.
that's, that word zeroing in is helpful, because Neville talks about the pursuit of truth involves making hypotheses. Okay? We hypothesize that this is true, and he says that we approach the truth when there is a community of people who are all pursuing the same truth, willing to be mutually corrective and illuminative with one another. And he has a great deal of confidence that if we were able to do that, we would, over time, we would close in on the truth. You know, it's a little bit like, to use a mathematical analogy, when there's a curve that is slowly moving towards an axis but never really gets there, it just keeps closing in on it. I think that's kind of what he would have in mind. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Anybody else?
I wouldn't.
Oh.
I never heard or even thought about the notion of biology playing into, you know, how I perceive the world, or so that was really news to me and interesting. And then I was wondering how, if biology of the human being, how that creates a culture. But then, since human beings are the same worldwide, how do we end up with different cultures when you have the same human biology? I don't know. I'll have to think about it.
Yep, good question. I would say over a lot of time, a lot of the cultures developed independently of one another. You know, we kind of take for granted the fact that we have intercommunication with different cultures today, but for a long time that wasn't the case, and some of those cultural categories happened independently of one another. And in fact, some of those cultural encounters are the source of some difficulty, because each culture perceives its categories to be true, you know? Or at least that's the categories through which they encounter the real. Anybody else? Lori, did you have your hand up?
I was trying to find the words. I was also wondering, taking under what you were just saying, you know, in the animal kingdom, certain of the same animals develop differently depending on where they are in the world and what their surroundings offer them, and their biology changes. You know, so there is a core set of biological truths, but biology also isn't universal because of where we live and what we eat, and you know, all the things that in particular areas is really different.
I think that's true.
We evolve.
I think it's true. But there's another book that I've read called The Evolution of Imagination, and by a guy named Stephen Asma. And this one was written 2017. He says that for a lot of thinkers, language makes imagination possible. When human beings developed language, they were able to imagine a world different than the animals. He says he thinks there is evidence to show the opposite, that imagination precedes the evolution into language. And certainly when language happens, the imagination that is pre-linguistic is able to be expanded and communicated, but he says imagination comes first, and then language makes that better. And I've shared this with some of you. My experiential verification of his thesis is that as I get older, that a lot of times I think of people and I can see their faces, okay, pre-linguistic, but I can't remember their names. And so I think that evolutionary process repeats itself in the individuals. And I think what you're describing is essentially an evolutionary process in animals. And Neville would say that other animals, not just humans, but other animals interpret their surroundings. they lack the same resources that we do, but they interpret their surroundings. Okay, so was there enough content tonight? The challenge is that just trying to get so many things into just a few presentations. But I got to say this, I am very impressed by you. I'm impressed by your gaminess in this, your willingness to unpack this and wrestle with it, and the seriousness with which you take it. And I think that will not go unrewarded for you. So as you keep wrestling with it, thinking about it, talking about it, you will, in fact, make progress in seeking, discovering, articulating, interpreting, and abiding in truth. Okay? So I'm going to ask you to please stand for our closing prayer. Lead us, lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts. Let peace fill our world. Let peace fill our universe. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts. Let peace fill our world. Let peace fill our universe. One more thing. This comes from a song that's in our hymnal. And I noticed a couple of years ago that this refrain is, the source of the refrain is mentioned at the bottom of the hymn, the song. It's from the Upanishads. It's Hindu scripture. It's very interesting, huh? And we had no problem singing this and making it our own. So more on this next week.